Picture this: a shy new girl clutching her grandmother's lucky coin, the only thing keeping her from complete isolation in a merciless high school. But when the school's most vicious bullies snatch her lunch money and humiliate her in front of everyone, they have no idea they've just awakened a sleeping dragon. What happens next will leave you stunned, as this quiet girl's hidden judo mastery turns the cafeteria into her personal dojo. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Get ready for a story of courage, hidden strength, and the most satisfying takedown you'll ever witness. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Jefferson High School like tiny fists demanding entry, each droplet racing down the glass in chaotic streams that reflected the fluorescent lights of the bustling hallway. Chen pressed her back against the cold metal of her locker, watching the chaos unfold around her with the careful observation of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest gestures. 3 weeks had passed since her family moved to Millbrook, Oregon, and she still felt like an intruder in someone else's story. Maya's fingers found the small brass coin tucked deep in her jacket pocket, its worn edges smooth from decades of handling. Her grandmother had pressed it into her palm the night before they left San Francisco, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she whispered the same words she'd spoken countless times throughout Maya's childhood. "This coin has traveled with our family for generations, little star. It carries the strength of all who came before you. When you feel lost, remember that you are never truly alone." The coin had belonged to Maya's great-great-grandmother, who had carried it from China to America in 1923, clutching it through the fear and uncertainty of Ellis Island. It had been with Maya's great-grandmother during the Great Depression, with her grandmother during World War II, and with her mother during her own difficult teenage years. Now it was Maya's turn to carry this small piece of family history, though she wondered if its supposed luck had somehow worn thin over the decades. Jefferson High was a sprawling brick fortress that housed nearly 2,000 students, its long corridors echoing with the sounds of slamming lockers, hurried footsteps, and the constant hum of teenage conversation. Maya had attended 3 different schools in her 16 years, following her father's job in software development from city to city, but none had felt quite as intimidating as this place. The students moved in established packs, their social hierarchies as rigid and unforgiving as any medieval court system. At the apex of Jefferson High's social pyramid sat Chelsea Morrison, a 17-year-old with platinum blonde hair that caught the light like spun gold and green eyes that could shift from charming to calculating in the space of a heartbeat. Chelsea's father owned the largest car dealership in the county, and her mother sat on the school board, connections that made her practically untouchable within the school's ecosystem. She ruled her domain with a combination of charisma and cruelty that kept her subjects both loyal and terrified. Chelsea's inner circle consisted of 2 devoted followers who had hitched their social survival to her rising star. Amber Rodriguez was a petite girl with an impossibly white smile and a talent for psychological warfare disguised as concerned friendship. She could deliver the most devastating insults while maintaining an expression of innocent confusion, as if she couldn't possibly understand why anyone would be upset by her words. Beside her stood Jessica Park, a tall athlete whose volleyball scholarship prospects made her valuable to Chelsea's empire. Jessica preferred more direct methods of intimidation, using her imposing physical presence to make smaller students feel like prey animals caught in the open. Maya had managed to avoid their attention for her first 2 weeks at Jefferson High by perfecting the art of invisibility. She ate lunch alone in the library, volunteered to help teachers during free periods, and mapped out routes through the school that avoided the popular gathering spots. Her strategy had worked until the morning when Mrs. Patterson, her well-meaning biology teacher, assigned lab partners alphabetically and paired Maya with Derek Morrison, Chelsea's younger brother. Derek was everything his sister wasn't: quiet, thoughtful, and genuinely kind. He had inherited their father's dark hair and their mother's gentle demeanor, traits that made him something of an anomaly in the Morrison family. While Chelsea basked in attention and social manipulation, Derek preferred the company of books and the 2 or 3 close friends who appreciated his dry sense of humor. He had watched his sister's reign of terror for years with growing discomfort, but had never found the courage to directly oppose her. The partnership with Derek had been a bright spot in Maya's otherwise lonely existence at Jefferson High. They worked well together, Derek's methodical approach complementing Maya's intuitive understanding of scientific concepts. During their lab sessions, Maya found herself laughing for the first time since arriving in Millbrook. Derek's quiet observations about their classmates and teachers revealing a sharp wit that he kept carefully hidden from most of the school. Their friendship might have continued to develop in peaceful obscurity, if not for the afternoon. When Chelsea caught them walking together toward the parking lot, their heads bent over Derek's chemistry notes as Maya helped him understand a particularly complex concept. Chelsea's eyes had narrowed with the focused intensity of a predator spotting potential prey, her mind already calculating the threat this new girl might pose to her carefully constructed world. That night, Chelsea had interrogated Derek over dinner, her questions casual but probing. Who was this new girl? Where had she come from? Why was Derek spending so much time with her? Derek, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering, had tried to downplay the relationship, describing Maya as just a lab partner who was helping him with chemistry. But Chelsea had seen something in her brother's eyes when he spoke about Maya, a warmth and genuine affection that she recognized as potentially problematic. Maya's living situation added another layer of complexity to her already challenging adjustment to life in Millbrook. Her parents had purchased a small house in the older part of town, far from the sprawling suburban developments where most of Jefferson High's students lived. The house was charming in its own way, with a wraparound porch and mature oak trees that provided blessed shade during the summer months, but it clearly marked Maya's family as outsiders to the established social order. Maya's father, David Chen, worked long hours at a tech startup downtown, often leaving before Maya woke up and returning after she had finished her homework. Her mother, Linda, had taken a part-time job at the local hospital while she studied to have her nursing credentials recognized in Oregon. The transition had been difficult for the entire family, but they had approached it with the same quiet determination that had carried them through previous moves. Maya understood that her parents were doing their best to provide for the family, but the long hours and financial stress of the move had created a distance between them that she struggled to bridge. She found herself spending more and more time alone, relying on the brass coin in her pocket and the memory of her grandmother's words to provide the comfort she couldn't find elsewhere. The bullying began subtly, as it often does in the sophisticated ecosystem of high school social dynamics. Maya would find her locker decorated with sticky notes bearing messages like, "Go back where you came from," or "Nobody wants you here." Her backpack would be moved from where she left it, forcing her to waste precious minutes searching for it between classes. Someone had created a fake social media account using her name and posted embarrassing photos that had been digitally altered to make her look foolish. Chelsea's campaign against Maya was masterfully orchestrated, designed to isolate and humiliate, without leaving clear evidence of direct involvement. She would start rumors about Maya's family, suggesting that they were probably illegal immigrants, or that her father was involved in some kind of criminal activity. She would organize events and parties, making sure that invitations were distributed just loudly enough for Maya to overhear what she was being excluded from. The psychological warfare escalated when Chelsea discovered that Maya brought her lunch from home each day, carefully packed meals that reflected her mother's attempts to provide nutritious food on their tight budget. Chelsea began making loud comments about the weird smells coming from Maya's lunch, wrinkling her nose dramatically whenever Maya opened her container. Her followers quickly joined in, creating an atmosphere of disgust and mockery that made Maya's lunch period a daily ordeal. Maya tried to ignore the harassment, focusing instead on her studies and the small pleasures she could find in her new life. She had discovered a quiet corner of the school library where she could eat her lunch in peace, surrounded by books that transported her to other worlds where social hierarchies didn't matter, and kindness was valued over cruelty. She threw herself into her schoolwork with the intensity of someone who understood that academic success might be her only path to escape. But Chelsea wasn't content with passive aggression and social exclusion. She needed a more dramatic demonstration of her power, something that would cement Maya's position at the bottom of the social ladder while reinforcing her own dominance. The opportunity came during the third week of October, when Maya made the mistake of sitting at a table in the cafeteria instead of retreating to her usual sanctuary in the library. Maya had been running late that morning, having stayed up until midnight helping her mother fill out paperwork for her nursing certification. She had overslept and rushed through her morning routine, forgetting to pack her usual lunch in her haste to catch the bus. By the time lunch period arrived, she was exhausted and hungry, her usual decision-making compromised by fatigue and low blood sugar. The cafeteria at Jefferson High was a massive space that could accommodate nearly 800 students across 2 lunch periods.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The room was divided into invisible territories as clearly marked as any battlefield, with each social group claiming their traditional tables and defending them against encroachment. The popular kids occupied the center tables, their proximity to the serving lines and the supervisor's desk marking their elevated status. The athletes claimed the tables near the windows, the natural light flattering their carefully maintained physiques. The various academic and artistic cliques spread out from there, each group's distance from the center roughly corresponding to their place in the school's social hierarchy. Maya approached the lunch line with her carefully hoarded lunch money clutched in her hand. $10 represented a significant portion of her weekly allowance, money that her parents had calculated to cover her school meals for 2 days. She had been saving it for emergencies, preferring to bring lunch from home both for financial reasons and to avoid the social minefield of the cafeteria. But today, with her stomach growling and her energy flagging, she decided to risk it. The lunch offerings at Jefferson High were typical of institutional food service: pizza that had been under heat lamps for too long, hamburgers that bore only a passing resemblance to actual meat, and a salad bar that looked like it had been assembled from ingredients that had seen better days. Maya selected a turkey sandwich and a bottle of water, choices that seemed safe and unlikely to cause digestive problems during her afternoon classes. As she stood in line to pay, Maya felt the familiar weight of the brass coin in her pocket and drew comfort from its presence. Her grandmother had always told her that the coin would bring good luck, but Maya had begun to wonder if its power was more about the confidence it gave her than any supernatural properties. Either way, she needed all the help she could get to navigate the treacherous waters of high school social dynamics. The cashier, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who had probably seen thousands of students pass through her line over the years, processed Maya's payment with the efficient indifference of someone who had learned not to get emotionally invested in the daily dramas of teenage life. Maya pocketed her change and turned to survey the cafeteria, looking for an empty table where she could eat in relative peace. Most of the tables were already occupied, their occupants engaged in the complicated social rituals that define teenage relationships. Maya spotted a small table near the back of the cafeteria that appeared to be unoccupied, its surface still sticky from the previous lunch period but otherwise available. She made her way across the room, trying to move quickly enough to avoid drawing attention but not so fast as to appear panicked. The table was positioned, unfortunately, close to Chelsea's usual spot, a prime piece of real estate in the center of the cafeteria that commanded a clear view of the entire room. Chelsea held court there like a queen receiving supplicants, her voice carrying across the space as she dispensed judgment on fashion choices, relationship drama, and social infractions. Maya hadn't noticed the proximity when she chose her seat, focused as she was on finding any available space. Chelsea noticed Maya immediately, her predatory instincts finely tuned to detect potential targets. She had been holding forth about the upcoming homecoming dance, critiquing the dress choices of various classmates with the casual cruelty that her followers had learned to appreciate. But the sight of Maya sitting alone at a nearby table, vulnerable and isolated, presented too tempting an opportunity to ignore. Maya unwrapped her sandwich and took a cautious bite, the processed turkey and white bread tasting like cardboard in her mouth. She tried to focus on a chemistry textbook she had brought with her, hoping that appearing busy and studious would make her less interesting to potential tormentors. But she could feel eyes on her, the weight of attention that made her skin crawl with anticipation of whatever humiliation was about to unfold. Chelsea rose from her table with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention, her movements deliberate and theatrical. She approached Maya's table with Amber and Jessica flanking her like bodyguards, their formation designed to maximize intimidation while maintaining plausible deniability. To casual observers, they might simply be 3 friends approaching a lonely classmate to make conversation. "Well, well, well," Chelsea said, her voice pitched to carry across the surrounding tables. "Look who decided to join the rest of us common folk in the cafeteria today." Maya looked up from her textbook, her heart rate immediately accelerating as she recognized the danger she was in. She had hoped to avoid this kind of direct confrontation, but she realized now that her presence in Chelsea's territory had been interpreted as a challenge that demanded response. The surrounding tables had gone quiet, their occupants sensing drama and turning their attention to the unfolding scene. "I'm just eating lunch," Maya said quietly, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the cafeteria. She kept her eyes fixed on her sandwich, hoping that submissive body language might diffuse the situation before it escalated. "Just eating lunch," Chelsea repeated, her tone mocking. "How sweet. But I couldn't help but notice that you've been spending a lot of time with my brother lately. Derek's such a trusting soul, always trying to help people who are less fortunate." The words hit Maya like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage. She felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. Her grandmother had always taught her that bullies fed on emotional reactions, that the best defense was often to refuse to give them the satisfaction they craved. "Derek's been helping me with chemistry," Maya said, still keeping her voice low and respectful. "He's a good lab partner." "A good lab partner," Jessica echoed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "That's so nice. But some people might get the wrong idea about a girl like you spending so much time with someone like Derek." The implication was clear, and Maya felt a surge of anger that she struggled to contain. They were suggesting that her friendship with Derek was somehow inappropriate, that she was using him for social advancement or romantic purposes. The accusation was both insulting and infuriating, but Maya knew that any defensive response would only fuel their attack. Amber stepped closer to Maya's table, her petite frame deceptive in its apparent harmlessness. She had perfected the art of delivering devastating insults while maintaining an expression of innocent concern, a skill that made her particularly dangerous in the ecosystem of teenage social warfare. "We're just worried about you," Amber said, her voice pitched to sound caring and maternal. "It must be so hard being the new girl, not knowing anyone, not understanding how things work here. We wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself by misreading social cues." Maya's grip tightened on her sandwich, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining her composure. She could feel the brass coin pressing against her leg through her pocket, a small reminder of her family's strength and resilience. Her great-great-grandmother had faced far worse than high school bullies, had endured prejudice and hardship that made this confrontation seem trivial by comparison. "I appreciate your concern," Maya said, her voice growing slightly stronger. "But I'm fine. Derek and I are just friends working on a school project." Chelsea's smile turned predatory, her green eyes glittering with malicious amusement. She had been testing Maya's defenses, probing for weaknesses, and she had found what she was looking for. Maya's attempt to maintain dignity in the face of harassment had been interpreted as defiance, a challenge to Chelsea's authority that could not go unanswered. "Just friends," Chelsea repeated, her voice rising slightly to ensure that the surrounding tables could hear every word. "That's interesting, because Derek seemed pretty excited when he was talking about you at dinner last night. Almost like he might have a little crush on his new Asian lab partner." The racial undertone in Chelsea's words sent a shockwave through Maya's system, transforming her embarrassment into something much more dangerous. She had experienced casual racism before, the thoughtless comments and assumptions that came with being one of the few Asian students in predominantly white schools. But this felt different, more calculated and cruel, designed to reduce her to a stereotype rather than attack her as an individual. Maya set down her sandwich and looked directly at Chelsea for the first time since the confrontation began. Her dark eyes were steady and calm, but there was something in their depths that made Chelsea's smile falter slightly. It was a look that suggested depths of strength and determination that Chelsea had not expected to find in her chosen victim. "I think you should go back to your table now," Maya said, her voice quiet but carrying an undertone of steel that made several nearby students look up from their own conversations. Chelsea blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting this level of resistance from someone she had pegged as an easy target. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her perfectly made-up features, but then her expression hardened, her pride stung by the suggestion that she should retreat from a confrontation she had initiated. "Excuse me?" Chelsea said, her voice rising to a level that drew attention from across the cafeteria. "Did you just tell me what to do?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Maya realized that she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The cafeteria had gone almost completely quiet, hundreds of students sensing that they were witnessing something significant. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see whether she would back down or stand her ground. Maya's hand found the brass coin in her pocket, her fingers tracing its familiar edges as she drew strength from the generations of women who had carried it before her. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. When you feel lost, remember that you are never truly alone. She wasn't alone, she realized. She carried the courage of her ancestors, the determination of women who had faced far greater challenges than a teenage bully in a high school cafeteria. "I asked you to leave me alone," Maya said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just trying to eat my lunch." Jessica stepped forward, her athletic build making her tower over Maya's seated form. Her face was flushed with anger, her reputation as Chelsea's enforcer requiring her to respond to what she perceived as disrespect toward her leader. "You think you're better than us?" Jessica demanded, her voice loud enough to carry to the far corners of the cafeteria. "Coming in here with your weird food and your stuck-up attitude, thinking you can just ignore people when they're trying to be nice to you?" Maya felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, her body's natural response to perceived threat. But this time, instead of the paralyzing fear she had experienced during previous confrontations, she felt something else. A calm certainty that she would not be driven from this place without a fight. She had run from bullies before, had allowed them to dictate where she could go and what she could do, but something about this moment felt different, final, as if all the accumulated humiliations and compromises of her life had reached a critical mass. "I never said I was better than anyone," Maya replied, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that made several students lean forward to hear her words. "I just want to be left alone." Amber giggled, a sound like breaking glass that made Maya's skin crawl. She had been watching the exchange with the fascination of someone who enjoyed watching others' pain, her petite features arranged in an expression of mock sympathy. "Oh, honey," Amber said, her voice dripping with false concern. "If you wanted to be left alone, you shouldn't have come to our school. This is our territory, and we don't appreciate outsiders who don't know their place." The word outsiders hit Maya like a physical blow, carrying with it all the weight of a lifetime of being made to feel like she didn't belong. She had heard it before, in different forms and different contexts, but it never lost its power to wound. The suggestion that she was somehow less entitled to occupy this space, to exist in this community because of her race or her newcomer status, awakened something primal and fierce in her chest. Maya stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. At 5 feet 4 inches, she was not particularly tall, but there was something in her posture that made her seem larger than her physical dimensions. Her shoulders were straight, her chin lifted, and her dark eyes held a steady intensity that made Chelsea take an involuntary step backward. "This is my school too," Maya said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the now silent cafeteria. "I have just as much right to be here as anyone else." Chelsea's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. She had expected Maya to crumble under the pressure of public humiliation, to retreat in tears like so many of her previous victims. Instead, she found herself facing someone who seemed to grow stronger under attack, who refused to be intimidated by superior numbers or social status. "Right to be here?" Chelsea laughed, but the sound was forced and brittle. "You've been here for 3 whole weeks and you think you have rights. You don't know anything about this place or these people. You're nothing but a charity case whose parents probably can't even afford to live in a decent neighborhood." The attack on her family's financial situation was expertly calculated to cause maximum damage. Chelsea had done her research, had discovered through her network of informants that Maya's family lived in the older, less affluent part of town. The implication that Maya was somehow inferior because of her family's economic circumstances was designed to shame her into submission. But instead of the expected humiliation, Maya felt a surge of pride in her parents' sacrifices and hard work. Her father worked long hours to provide for their family, and her mother was pursuing her dream of becoming a nurse despite the challenges of starting over in a new place. They had taught her that a person's worth was measured by their character and actions, not by their bank account or zip code. "You're right," Maya said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I don't know everything about this place, but I know enough to recognize a bully when I see one." The word bully fell into the silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock and excitement throughout the cafeteria. Students who had been passively watching the confrontation suddenly sat up straighter, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Nobody spoke to Chelsea Morrison like that, certainly not a new girl with no social standing or protection. Chelsea's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a cold calculation that made Maya's stomach clench with apprehension. She had pushed too far, had challenged Chelsea's authority in the most public way possible. There would be consequences for this moment of defiance, she realized, but she found that she didn't care. She was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of allowing other people's cruelty to dictate how she lived her life. "A bully?" Chelsea repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "You think I'm a bully? I was trying to be nice to you, trying to help you understand how things work here. But clearly you're too stupid to appreciate friendly advice." She took a step closer to Maya's table, her perfect features twisted with genuine anger. The mask of concern and false friendship had finally slipped, revealing the calculating predator beneath. Jessica and Amber flanked her, their body language aggressive and threatening. "Maybe you need a lesson in respect," Chelsea continued, her voice rising to ensure that every student in the cafeteria could hear her words. "Maybe you need to learn what happens to people who think they can come into our school and disrespect us." Maya felt her heart racing, adrenaline flooding her system as she recognized the escalation in Chelsea's tone and posture. She had been in situations like this before, had learned to read the signs that preceded physical confrontation. Her mind raced through possible responses, calculating angles of escape and defensive positions with a speed and precision that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as the quiet new girl. "I don't want any trouble," Maya said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I just want to eat my lunch and be left alone." "Too late for that," Jessica interjected, cracking her knuckles with theatrical menace. "You should have thought about that before you decided to mouth off to Chelsea." Maya's hand instinctively moved toward her pocket, seeking the comfort of her grandmother's coin. But as her fingers touched the brass surface, she realized that she was no longer the frightened little girl who had needed a lucky charm to feel safe. The coin wasn't magic, she understood now. The strength her grandmother had spoken of didn't come from the metal itself, but from the courage and determination it represented. The coin was a symbol of her family's resilience, a reminder that she came from a long line of women who had faced adversity and emerged stronger. Chelsea reached across the table and grabbed Maya's lunch tray, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapping around the plastic edges with possessive authority. The gesture was calculated to be both humiliating and threatening, a demonstration of her power to take whatever she wanted from those she deemed inferior. "You know what?" Chelsea said, her voice sweet with false reasonableness. "I don't think you deserve to eat today. Someone who can't show proper respect doesn't deserve the privilege of sharing a meal with the rest of us." She lifted the tray from the table, holding it just out of Maya's reach, with a smile that was purely predatory. The sandwich that Maya had barely touched, the water bottle she had spent precious lunch money on, the small bag of chips that represented a rare treat in her carefully budgeted diet. All of it was now at Chelsea's mercy. "Give that back," Maya said, her voice quiet but firm. "That's my lunch." "Your lunch?" Amber giggled, her voice pitched high with mock confusion. "I don't see your name on it. Besides, I thought your people were supposed to be good at math. Maybe you should have calculated whether you could afford to waste money on cafeteria food before you spent it." The racist undertone in Amber's comment sent a shockwave through the watching students. Even those who had been enjoying the spectacle of Maya's humiliation seemed uncomfortable with the blatant prejudice, their faces showing a mixture of embarrassment and uncertainty. Several students looked around nervously, as if hoping that a teacher or administrator would intervene before the situation escalated further. But the lunch supervisors were dealing with a spilled drink near the serving line, their attention focused on cleaning up the mess and preventing students from slipping on the wet floor. The cafeteria's acoustics meant that the confrontation at Maya's table was clearly audible to nearby students, but might not have reached the adults stationed around the room's perimeter. Maya felt something snap inside her chest, a lifetime of accumulated frustrations and humiliations reaching a breaking point. She had endured casual racism, social exclusion, and psychological intimidation with quiet dignity, always choosing to walk away rather than fight back. But this moment felt different, final, as if all the previous injustices had been building toward this single point of confrontation. "I said give it back," Maya repeated, her voice carrying a new edge that made several nearby students look up from their conversations. "That's my food, and I paid for it." Chelsea's smile widened, sensing that she had finally found Maya's breaking point. She held the tray higher, just out of reach, like a parent teasing a child with a coveted toy. The gesture was designed to emphasize Maya's powerlessness, to demonstrate to the watching crowd that Chelsea could take whatever she wanted without consequence. "Make me," Chelsea said, her voice loud enough to carry across the entire cafeteria. "If you want it so badly, why don't you try to take it from me?" The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down before a medieval duel. Every student in the cafeteria was now watching, their conversations forgotten as they witnessed what appeared to be the final act of Maya's social destruction. Cell phones appeared as if by magic, students positioning themselves to record whatever happened next for later distribution on social media. Maya looked at the tray in Chelsea's hands, at the sandwich that represented her lunch money and her parents' hard work, at the water bottle that she had carefully selected from the limited options available to her budget. But more than that, she saw a symbol of every time she had been forced to back down, every moment when she had chosen safety over dignity, every occasion when she had allowed someone else's cruelty to go unchallenged. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "You carry the strength of all who came before you." Maya thought of her great-great-grandmother, crossing an ocean with nothing but hope and determination. She thought of her great-grandmother, surviving the Depression with grace and resilience. She thought of her grandmother, raising children in a foreign country while maintaining her dignity and cultural identity. She thought of her mother, starting over in a new state with courage and optimism. Maya had inherited more than just a brass coin from these women. She had inherited their strength, their refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond their control, their determination to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult or dangerous. The coin in her pocket was not a magical talisman, but a reminder of the power that had always been within her. "I'm not going to fight you for my lunch," Maya said, her voice calm and steady, "but I'm not going to let you steal it either." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet, extracting the remaining $6 of her lunch money. The bills were crisp and new, representing her allowance for the rest of the week and her parents' careful budgeting to ensure she had enough to eat at school. "This is all the money I have for lunch this week," Maya said, holding up the bills so that everyone in the cafeteria could see them. "My parents gave me this money because they work hard to take care of our family. You can take my lunch today, but you can't take my dignity." The simple statement cut through the cafeteria's tension like a blade, its quiet honesty making Chelsea's theatrical cruelty seem petty and small by comparison. Several students shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own participation in the social dynamics that had led to this moment. Others looked ashamed, realizing that they had been complicit in the systematic exclusion and humiliation of someone whose only crime was being different. Chelsea's face flushed an ugly red, her perfect composure cracking under the weight of Maya's moral authority. She had expected tears, pleading, perhaps angry threats that would justify escalating to physical violence. Instead, she found herself faced with someone who refused to be degraded, who maintained her dignity even in defeat. "Keep your stupid money," Chelsea snarled, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Nobody wants your charity case dollars anyway." She turned the tray over, dumping Maya's lunch onto the floor with deliberate malice. The sandwich hit the linoleum with a wet splat, its contents scattering across the grimy surface. The water bottle rolled under a nearby table, its cap popping off and sending liquid streaming across the floor. The bag of chips exploded on impact, sending fragments flying in all directions. The cafeteria erupted in gasps and nervous laughter, students pulling out their phones to record the aftermath of the confrontation. Maya stared down at her ruined lunch, at the sandwich her mother had probably hoped would provide her with good nutrition, at the water that would have helped her stay hydrated through her afternoon classes. But instead of the expected tears or angry outburst, Maya did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She smiled. It wasn't a happy smile or a bitter one. It was the smile of someone who had finally understood something important about herself and the world around her. She looked up at Chelsea, who was still standing over the mess she had created, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the now silent cafeteria. "Thank you," Maya said, her voice clear and strong. "You've just shown everyone exactly who you really are." Chelsea blinked in confusion, clearly not expecting gratitude in response to her act of deliberate cruelty. She looked around the cafeteria, suddenly aware that the laughter and approval she had expected from her audience was notably absent. Instead, she saw faces filled with discomfort, embarrassment, and in some cases, outright disapproval. "What's that supposed to mean?" Chelsea demanded, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. She was beginning to realize that her victory was not as complete as she had expected, that something about Maya's response had shifted the dynamic in ways she didn't fully understand. Maya knelt down and began collecting the scattered pieces of her lunch, her movements deliberate and dignified. She gathered the remnants of her sandwich, the empty chip bag, the water bottle with its remaining contents. She didn't speak, didn't look at Chelsea or her followers, just quietly cleaned up the mess with the careful attention of someone performing a ritual. Jessica stepped forward, her face flushed with anger and confusion. She had expected Maya to either fight back or flee in tears, not to respond with this strange combination of grace and determination. The lack of expected reaction made her feel off balance, uncertain how to proceed. "What are you doing?" Jessica demanded. "Just leave it. The janitor will clean it up." Maya looked up from her task, her dark eyes meeting Jessica's with steady calm. "I'm taking responsibility for my choices," she said simply. "Even when other people don't take responsibility for theirs." The statement hit like a physical blow, its implication clear to everyone listening. Maya was not just talking about cleaning up spilled food, she was talking about moral responsibility, about the choice to treat others with dignity, even when they refused to extend the same courtesy. Amber stepped forward, her face twisted with frustrated rage. She had been anticipating a dramatic conclusion to the confrontation, perhaps involving tears or threats that would cement their victory over the new girl. Instead, she found herself watching Maya perform an act of quiet dignity that somehow made their behavior seem petty and cruel. "You think you're so special," Amber hissed, her voice lacking its earlier fake sweetness. "You think you're better than us because you won't fight back, but you're just scared, just like every other loser who comes through here." Maya finished collecting the remnants of her lunch and stood up slowly, the plastic tray balanced in her hands. She looked at Amber with the same calm intensity she had shown throughout the confrontation, her dark eyes reflecting a depth of character that made the other girl's shallow cruelty seem even more pronounced. "You're right," Maya said quietly. "I am scared. I'm scared of becoming someone who finds pleasure in causing pain to others. I'm scared of losing the values my family taught me. I'm scared of becoming the kind of person who would destroy someone's lunch just to feel powerful." The words fell into the silence, like stones into deep water, creating ripples of discomfort throughout the watching crowd. Several students looked down at their phones or their own lunches, suddenly unable to meet Maya's steady gaze. The simple honesty of her response had transformed the confrontation from entertainment into something much more uncomfortable, a mirror that reflected their own complicity in the social dynamics that had led to this moment. Chelsea's face cycled through a series of expressions as she struggled to process what had just happened. She had orchestrated this confrontation to demonstrate her power and to put Maya firmly in her place at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Instead, she found herself standing over a mess she had created while Maya somehow managed to emerge with her dignity intact and even enhanced. "Whatever," Chelsea said finally, her voice lacking conviction. "Come on, girls, we don't need to waste any more time on this loser." But as she turned to leave, something unexpected happened. Derek Morrison appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face pale with shock and anger as he took in the scene before him. He had been delayed in getting to lunch by a meeting with his calculus teacher, and he arrived just in time to witness his sister's final act of cruelty. "What did you do?" Derek asked, his voice quiet but carrying across the cafeteria with startling clarity. The question was directed at Chelsea, but his eyes were fixed on Maya, who was still holding the tray of ruined food. Chelsea's face flushed with embarrassment and anger at being confronted by her brother in front of the entire school. Their family dynamics had always been complicated, with Derek's gentle nature serving as a constant reminder of the person Chelsea might have been if she had chosen a different path. "Nothing that concerns you," Chelsea snapped, but her voice carried a defensive edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Just teaching the new girl about how things work around here." Derek looked at the mess on the floor, at Maya's dignified posture, at the ring of students with their phones out recording what they clearly expected to be a moment of social media gold. His face hardened with an expression that few people at Jefferson High had ever seen from the quiet, bookish Morrison sibling. "By destroying her lunch?" Derek asked, his voice growing stronger. "By humiliating her in front of the entire school? Is that really who you want to be, Chelsea?" The use of her first name instead of his usual affectionate Chels hit Chelsea like a physical blow. Derek had never challenged her publicly before, had always maintained the family solidarity that their parents expected, even when he disagreed with her methods. His public criticism felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any stranger's disapproval. "Don't you dare lecture me," Chelsea hissed, stepping closer to her brother with her fists clenched at her sides. "You don't know anything about running this school or maintaining order. Someone has to keep the freaks and losers in line." "Maya isn't a freak or a loser," Derek said, his voice carrying to every corner of the cafeteria. "She's one of the smartest people I've ever met, and she's been nothing but kind to everyone she's encountered here. If anyone needs to be kept in line, it's people who think cruelty makes them powerful." The confrontation between the Morrison siblings had transformed the dynamics of the entire scene. Students who had been content to watch Maya's humiliation as entertainment now found themselves witnessing a family drama that felt much more personal and uncomfortable. The fact that Derek was defending Maya against his own sister added layers of complexity that made simple social media mockery seem inappropriate. Maya watched the exchange with a mixture of gratitude and concern. She appreciated Derek's support, but she also recognized that his public defense of her would have consequences for both of them. Chelsea's anger at being challenged would now extend to her brother, and Maya would be blamed for coming between them. "Derek," Maya said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. "It's okay. You don't need to." "Yes, I do," Derek interrupted, his eyes still fixed on his sister. "I should have said something a long time ago. I should have stood up to this behavior instead of pretending it wasn't happening." Chelsea's face was now bright red with humiliation and rage. She had built her entire social identity around the assumption that her family supported her methods, even if they didn't always approve of her targets. Derek's public rejection of her behavior threatened the foundation of her carefully constructed world. "Fine," Chelsea said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Choose the freak over your own sister. See how that works out for you." She turned on her heel and stalked toward the cafeteria exit, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum with sharp, angry sounds. Amber and Jessica hesitated for a moment, looking between their departed leader and the crowd of students who were now focused on Derek and Maya. Without Chelsea's commanding presence to guide them, they seemed unsure how to proceed. "This isn't over," Jessica said finally, her voice lacking conviction. "You can't just come in here and turn people against each other." Maya looked at Jessica with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout the confrontation. "I didn't turn anyone against anyone," she said quietly. "I just tried to eat my lunch." Jessica's face flushed with embarrassment as she realized how petty her threat sounded in the face of Maya's simple honesty. She mumbled something inaudible and followed Amber toward the exit, leaving Derek and Maya standing in the center of the cafeteria surrounded by scattered food and curious onlookers. The silence stretched for several long moments before Derek stepped forward and began helping Maya clean up the remaining mess. His actions seemed to break the spell that had held the other students transfixed, and several of them moved forward to offer assistance. Within minutes, the floor was clean and the evidence of the confrontation had been removed. "I'm sorry," Derek said as they deposited the last of the debris in a nearby trash can. "I'm sorry about my sister, and I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Maya shook her head, her hand instinctively moving to the brass coin in her pocket. "You don't need to apologize for her choices," she said. "And you spoke up when it mattered most." Derek looked around the cafeteria, which was slowly returning to its normal rhythm as students processed what they had witnessed. "She's going to make things difficult for both of us now," he said. "Chelsea doesn't forgive public humiliation easily." Maya smiled. And for the first time since the confrontation began, it was a genuine expression of warmth rather than determined dignity. "Let her try," she said. "I'm not the same person who walked into this cafeteria an hour ago." Derek studied her face, noting the subtle changes in her posture and expression. There was still kindness in her dark eyes, still the gentle intelligence that had first attracted his friendship. But there was something new as well. A quiet strength that hadn't been there before. A sense of someone who had discovered reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "What changed?" Derek asked, genuinely curious about the transformation he was witnessing. Maya touched the coin in her pocket, feeling its familiar weight and texture. "I remembered who I am," she said simply. "I remembered where I come from and what that means." As the lunch period wound toward its end, students began clearing their tables and preparing for afternoon classes. Many of them cast curious glances toward Maya and Derek, clearly processing the social implications of what they had witnessed. The story would spread through the school's social networks within hours, probably enhanced and distorted with each retelling. Maya gathered her textbooks and prepared to leave the cafeteria, her stomach still empty but her spirit somehow nourished by the confrontation. She had lost her lunch, but she had gained something far more valuable. The knowledge that she could stand up for herself without compromising her values, that she could face cruelty with dignity and emerge stronger. "Maya," Derek called as she headed toward the exit. "Would you like to have lunch together tomorrow? I know a quiet spot in the library where we won't be bothered." Maya paused, considering the offer and its implications. Accepting Derek's invitation would cement their alliance in the eyes of the school, making them both targets for Chelsea's future retaliation. But it would also mean she wouldn't have to face the social minefield of the cafeteria alone. "I'd like that," she said finally. "But are you sure? Your sister is going to be angry enough already." Derek's smile was rueful but determined. "Chelsea's anger is her choice," he said. "I'm tired of letting her choices control my life." As Maya walked toward her afternoon classes, she felt the brass coin warm against her palm. Her grandmother had been right about its power, though not in the way Maya had originally understood. The coin didn't bring luck in the magical sense. It brought strength through connection to something larger than herself. It reminded her that she was part of a long line of women who had faced adversity with courage and grace, who had refused to be diminished by the cruelty of others. The confrontation in the cafeteria had been just the beginning, Maya realized. Chelsea Morrison was not the type of person to accept defeat gracefully, and the public nature of her humiliation would demand a response. There would be other challenges, other tests of Maya's newfound resolve. But for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Maya felt ready to face whatever came next. She had discovered something important about herself in those moments of confrontation. She was stronger than she had known, more resilient than she had imagined. The quiet girl who had entered Jefferson High 3 weeks ago, hoping only to survive until graduation, had been transformed into someone who understood that survival was not enough. She deserved more than just to exist in the margins of other people's lives. She deserved respect, dignity, and the right to occupy space in the world without apology. The brass coin in her pocket felt lighter now, as if it had transferred some of its accumulated weight to her spirit. Maya Chen was no longer just the new girl trying to blend into the background. She was someone with a voice, someone with strength, someone who would not be easily moved or broken. And tomorrow, when she faced whatever new challenges Chelsea had devised, she would face them with the courage of all the women who had carried this coin before her. The story was far from over, but the first act had ended with Maya still standing, still dignified, still strong. And that, she realized, was victory enough for now. The week following the cafeteria incident transformed Jefferson High into a battlefield of whispers and sideways glances. Maya noticed the change immediately, the way conversations stopped when she walked by. How students pulled out their phones to record her movements through the hallways. The video of Chelsea dumping her lunch had gone viral within the school's social media ecosystem, spawning dozens of reaction videos and comment threads that dissected every moment of the confrontation. But something unexpected had emerged from the chaos. Where Maya had expected isolation and increased hostility, she found pockets of surprising support. Students she had never spoken to nodded respectfully when they passed her in the halls. A few even approached her between classes to express their admiration for how she had handled the situation. Sarah Martinez, a quiet sophomore who had been on the receiving end of Chelsea's cruelty the previous year, slipped a note into Maya's locker, expressing solidarity and offering friendship. Maya discovered that her dignified response to Chelsea's attack had resonated with many students who had felt powerless in the face of the school's established hierarchy. They saw in her something they wished they could find in themselves: the courage to stand up to injustice without becoming the very thing they opposed. The brass coin in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth whenever these small acts of kindness occurred, as if her grandmother's spirit approved of the connection she was building. Derek kept his promise about lunch, meeting Maya at the library entrance each day with a cheerful determination that seemed to grow stronger despite the obvious social costs. His former friends from the popular crowd had begun treating him with the cool indifference reserved for social outcasts, and Maya noticed how he was gradually being excluded from the parties and activities that had once defined his social calendar. When she mentioned her concerns, Derek just shrugged with a maturity that surprised her. "I'm finding out who my real friends are," he said one afternoon as they settled into their usual corner of the library with sandwiches from home. "Turns out there weren't as many as I thought, but the ones who stayed are worth keeping." Their friendship deepened through these shared meals and study sessions. Maya learned that Derek's gentle nature was not weakness but strength, that his refusal to participate in his sister's cruelty had required its own form of courage. In return, she began sharing stories about her family's journey to America, about the traditions and values that had shaped her worldview, about the weight of carrying forward her ancestors' legacy of resilience. Chelsea's response to her public humiliation was as swift and merciless as Derek had predicted. Unable to directly confront Maya without appearing petty and vindictive, she launched a sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare designed to isolate her target and restore her own damaged reputation. Anonymous social media accounts began spreading rumors about Maya's family, suggesting they were in the country illegally or that her father was involved in criminal activities. The attacks escalated when someone vandalized Maya's locker with racial slurs and threats, forcing the school administration to finally acknowledge that there was a serious bullying problem at Jefferson High. Principal Watson, a well-meaning but overwhelmed administrator, called Maya into his office to discuss the situation. His questions were careful and diplomatic, clearly designed to address the problem without admitting the school's failure to protect its students. "I want you to know that we take these incidents very seriously," Principal Watson said, his hands folded carefully on his desk as he avoided direct eye contact. "We've increased hallway monitoring and are reviewing our anti-bullying policies. But I also want to ask if there's anything you might have done to escalate the situation." Maya felt a familiar surge of anger at the implication that she bore some responsibility for the harassment she was experiencing. The suggestion that her refusal to quietly accept mistreatment had somehow invited further abuse revealed the deep flaws in the school's approach to dealing with bullying. She thought of her grandmother's stories about facing discrimination in her early years in America, how authorities had often blamed the victims for provoking the very prejudice they were trying to escape. "I defended myself when someone destroyed my lunch," Maya said carefully, measuring each word. "I don't think that constitutes escalation." Principal Watson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing the weakness of his position, but unwilling to directly confront the Morrison family's influence within the school district. Of course. I'm just saying that sometimes it's better to walk away from confrontation, to give situations time to cool down." "And sometimes," Maya replied with quiet firmness, "walking away just encourages people to keep pushing until they find someone who won't fight back." That afternoon, Maya found herself walking home through Millbrook's tree-lined streets with a heavy heart. The conversation with Principal Watson had confirmed her suspicions that the school administration would not provide meaningful protection from Chelsea's campaign. She was essentially on her own, armed with nothing but her own inner strength and the support of a handful of unlikely allies. As she passed the community center where she had noticed a small martial arts studio during her first week in town, Maya paused to read the sign more carefully. Millbrook Judo Academy, traditional training for modern warriors. Sensei Marcus Thompson, 6th, Dan Black Belt. Through the window, she could see adults and children practicing throws and grappling techniques on blue mats, their movements fluid and controlled. Maya had discovered judo almost by accident when she was 12 years old. Her family had been living in Sacramento at the time, and her mother had enrolled her in a self-defense class at the local YMCA after a string of incidents involving older kids who targeted Asian students in their neighborhood. The instructor, a former Olympic competitor named Coach Rivera, had recognized something special in Maya's natural balance and spatial awareness. "You have the mind of a judoka," Coach Rivera had told her after her first month of training. "Judo is not about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about using your opponent's energy against them, about finding the moment when force becomes unnecessary, because technique provides the answer." Maya had thrown herself into judo training with the same intensity she brought to her academic studies. She loved the mental chess game of each match, the way a smaller, technically superior fighter could defeat someone twice their size through proper timing and leverage. By the time her family moved to Portland 2 years later, she had earned her brown belt and was competing in regional tournaments. In Portland, she had continued training at a dojo near their apartment, working her way toward her black belt, under the guidance of Sensei Nakamura, an elderly Japanese man who emphasized the philosophical aspects of martial arts alongside the physical techniques. She had been just 2 months away from her black belt test when her father's job opportunity brought them to Millbrook, forcing her to leave behind years of training and community. Standing outside the Millbrook Judo Academy, Maya felt a pull she hadn't experienced since leaving Portland. The brass coin in her pocket seemed to warm against her palm, as if encouraging her to take this step toward reclaiming a part of herself that she had thought was lost. Before she could second-guess the decision, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The familiar smell of the mats hit her immediately, that distinctive combination of rubber and exertion that marked every serious dojo. The sound of feet shuffling across the surface, of controlled breathing and sharp kiais, transported her back to countless hours of training and the sense of belonging she had found in the martial arts community. Sensei Thompson was working with a group of teenage students, demonstrating a hip throw that Maya recognized immediately as one of her favorites. He was a tall, powerfully built African-American man in his 40s, his movements displaying the effortless grace that came from decades of dedicated practice. When he noticed Maya watching from the doorway, he called for a water break and approached her with the patient courtesy that seemed universal among high-ranking martial artists. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to teaching and leadership. "I was wondering about training here," Maya said, suddenly feeling nervous about explaining her background and her current situation. "I practiced judo in my previous city, but I had to stop when we moved here." Sensei Thompson's eyes sharpened with interest. "What belt level were you at? And who was your instructor?" "Brown belt, first Q," Maya replied. "I was training under Sensei Nakamura in Portland, preparing for my Shoden test before we moved." The mention of Sensei Nakamura's name brought an immediate smile to Sensei Thompson's face. Hiroshi Nakamura, small man, about 70 years old, with a throw that could send you into next week. Maya nodded, surprised by the recognition. "You know him?" "He was one of my instructors when I was coming up through the ranks," Sensei Thompson said warmly. "If you were training under Hiroshi and he was preparing you for black belt, then you're welcome on these mats anytime. When can you start?" That evening, Maya called Sensei Nakamura in Portland, explaining her situation and asking for his recommendation. The elderly instructor listened carefully as she described not just her desire to continue training, but the challenges she was facing at her new school. His advice was characteristically direct and profound. "Judo teaches us that every attack contains within it the seeds of its own defeat," Sensei Nakamura said, his English still carrying traces of his Japanese accent after 50 years in America. "Your bullies think they are strong because they can hurt others, but they have revealed their greatest weakness. They need victims to feel powerful. A true judoka understands that strength comes from within, not from the submission of others." He paused for a moment before continuing. "You have been given an opportunity to test everything you have learned, not just the physical techniques but the mental discipline and spiritual principles. Remember, the goal is not to defeat your opponents but to neutralize their ability to cause harm while maintaining your own integrity." The next morning, Maya arrived at school with a new sense of purpose. She had made arrangements to begin training at the Millbrook Judo Academy that afternoon, and the prospect of returning to the mats filled her with anticipation. But more importantly, she felt reconnected to the philosophical foundations that had sustained her through previous challenges. Chelsea, meanwhile, had been busy orchestrating her next move. The public nature of her humiliation in the cafeteria had wounded her pride more deeply than any physical injury could have. She recognized that direct confrontation with Maya had backfired spectacularly, turning her into the villain in a story where she had expected to be the righteous enforcer of social order. Her new strategy would be more subtle, more personally devastating, and calculated to destroy Maya's growing network of support. The attack came during third-period chemistry class, where Maya and Derek continued their partnership despite the social costs. They were working on a complex titration experiment that required precise measurements and careful timing, their heads bent over their equipment as they recorded data and discussed their observations. Maya had begun to look forward to these sessions, finding in Derek's methodical approach to scientific problems a kindred spirit who shared her appreciation for logic and precision. Their concentration was broken by the arrival of a student aide with a message from the main office. Maya was requested to report to Principal Watson immediately, leaving Derek to complete their experiment alone. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Maya noticed Amber watching her with barely concealed glee, an expression that made her stomach clench with apprehension. The walk to the principal's office felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the certainty that whatever awaited her would not be pleasant. The brass coin in her pocket provided little comfort as she considered the various ways that Chelsea might have escalated their conflict. When she knocked on Principal Watson's door and was invited to enter, she found him seated behind his desk with an expression of grave concern. "Maya, please sit down," Principal Watson said, his tone more serious than during their previous conversation. "I'm afraid we need to discuss a very serious allegation that has been brought to our attention." Maya sat carefully in the chair across from his desk, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. Years of dealing with school administrators had taught her the importance of presenting a calm, respectful demeanor, even when facing unjust accusations. "What kind of allegation?" Principal Watson opened a file on his desk and removed several printed pages, their contents obscured from Maya's view. "We've received reports that you've been making threats against other students, specifically threatening to use martial arts training to harm them. These are very serious accusations, Maya, and we need to address them immediately." The words hit Maya like a physical blow, their implications clear and devastating. Someone had twisted her background in martial arts into a weapon against her, painting her not as a victim defending herself but as a potential aggressor threatening other students. The irony was almost overwhelming. The very training that emphasized discipline, respect, and restraint was being portrayed as evidence of violent intent. "I've never threatened anyone," Maya said carefully, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "I've barely spoken to most of the students here, and when I have, it's been completely respectful." Principal Watson nodded, as if he had expected this response. "I understand that's your perspective, but we have multiple witnesses who say you've been talking about your martial arts background in what they interpreted as threatening terms. Specifically, there are reports that you've claimed you could take down anyone who bothered you." Maya's mind raced as she tried to understand how her words could have been so completely misrepresented. She had mentioned her judo background to only a few people, and always in the context of explaining her interest in discipline and self-improvement, rather than as any kind of threat. The realization that these conversations had been deliberately distorted and reported to the administration revealed the sophistication of Chelsea's campaign against her. "May I ask who made these reports?" Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I can't reveal specific names," Principal Watson replied, "but I can tell you that these reports came from concerned students who felt genuinely threatened by your comments. We take all reports of potential violence very seriously, especially given the current climate around school safety." Maya felt the familiar surge of anger that had sustained her through the cafeteria confrontation, but this time it was tempered by a deeper understanding of the forces she was facing. Chelsea had learned from her previous mistake, abandoning direct confrontation in favor of a more insidious approach that would be much harder to defend against. By casting Maya as the aggressor, she had flipped the narrative and positioned herself as the victim seeking protection from a dangerous outsider. "Principal Watson," Maya said, choosing her words carefully, "I think you should know that I've been the target of systematic harassment since I arrived at this school. My locker has been vandalized, my belongings have been destroyed, and I've been subjected to racial slurs and personal attacks. If I mention my martial arts background, It was only in the context of explaining how I've learned to handle conflict without resorting to violence. Principal Watson's expression grew more uncomfortable as Maya spoke, clearly recognizing the difficult position he was in. The Morrison family's influence within the school district made any action against Chelsea politically problematic, while the increasing media attention around school bullying made ignoring legitimate complaints equally dangerous. "I understand that you feel you've been mistreated," he said finally. "But right now, we need to focus on these specific allegations about threats. I'm going to need you to sign an agreement stating that you will not engage in any physical altercations with other students, regardless of the circumstances." The request felt like a trap designed to limit Maya's ability to defend herself while providing no corresponding protection from her tormentors. By signing such an agreement, she would be acknowledging some level of wrongdoing, while giving Chelsea's allies a weapon to use against her if any future confrontation occurred. But refusing to sign would likely be interpreted as evidence of violent intent, confirming the false narrative that had been constructed around her. Maya thought of her grandmother's stories about facing impossible choices, about situations where every option carried serious consequences but where the preservation of dignity required taking a stand regardless of the cost. The brass coin in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding her that she carried the strength of generations of women who had faced similar moments of testing. "I'll sign an agreement that I will only use physical force to defend myself or others from immediate harm," Maya said carefully. "But I won't sign anything that prevents me from protecting myself if someone attacks me." Principal Watson sighed, clearly hoping for a more compliant response. "Maya, I'm trying to help you here. These allegations are serious enough that we could be looking at suspension or even expulsion. I'm offering you a way to resolve this situation without escalating it further." "And what about the people who have been harassing me?" Maya asked. "What consequences will they face for their behavior?" "If you have specific evidence of harassment, we'll certainly investigate," Principal Watson replied, but his tone suggested that such investigations would be perfunctory at best. "However, right now we need to deal with the immediate situation." Maya realized that she was facing a choice that would define not just her remaining time at Jefferson High, but her understanding of herself and her values. She could accept the school's characterization of her as a potential threat, sign their agreement, and hope that submitting to their demands would provide some measure of protection. Or she could maintain her principles and face whatever consequences came from refusing to accept blame for defending herself. The decision came to her with surprising clarity, as if all her years of martial arts training and her family's teachings about dignity and integrity had prepared her for this exact moment. She looked directly at Principal Watson, her dark eyes steady and calm. "I won't sign an agreement that makes me responsible for other people's actions," she said quietly. "I've never threatened anyone, and I won't pretend that I have just to make this easier for you to handle." Principal Watson's expression hardened, disappointment and frustration clear in his features. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Maya. In that case, I'm going to have to suspend you pending a full investigation of these allegations. You'll need to gather your things and leave campus immediately, and you cannot return until this matter is resolved." The words felt like a physical blow, but Maya forced herself to remain calm and dignified. She had expected this outcome from the moment the false allegations were presented, but the reality of being punished for defending herself still stung. As she stood to leave, she realized that Chelsea's strategy had been even more effective than direct confrontation. Maya was being removed from the school entirely, eliminating any possibility of her continuing to build support among her classmates. "How long will this investigation take?" Maya asked. "That depends on several factors," Principal Watson replied evasively. "We'll need to interview witnesses, review any available evidence, and determine the appropriate response. It could be anywhere from a few days to several weeks." Maya nodded, understanding that the timeline would likely be determined more by political considerations than by the actual facts of the case. The Morrison family's influence would ensure that the investigation proceeded slowly and carefully, giving Chelsea time to consolidate her position and further damage Maya's reputation. As Maya walked through the hallways toward her locker, she noticed how quickly news of her suspension had spread. Students stepped aside to let her pass, some with expressions of sympathy, others with barely concealed satisfaction. She gathered her textbooks and personal belongings methodically, refusing to hurry despite the uncomfortable attention she was receiving. Derek appeared at her locker just as she was closing it for what might be the last time. His face was pale with shock and anger, clearly having heard about the suspension through the school's efficient gossip network. "This is insane," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Everyone knows you haven't threatened anyone. How can they suspend you based on lies?" Maya shouldered her backpack and turned to face her friend, drawing strength from his unwavering support even as she recognized the difficult position her situation had placed him in. "Because it's easier than confronting the real problem," she said simply. "But it's not over." As she walked toward the school's exit, Maya felt the brass coin warming against her palm. Her grandmother had faced far greater injustices than this, had endured discrimination and persecution that made high school bullying seem trivial by comparison. But she had also taught Maya that true strength was not measured by the ability to avoid conflict, but by the grace with which one handled adversity. That afternoon, Maya arrived at the Millbrook Judo Academy 3 hours earlier than planned, her school suspension providing an unexpected opportunity to immerse herself in training. Sensei Thompson took one look at her expression and seemed to understand that something significant had happened. "Rough day?" he asked as Maya changed into the borrowed GI he had provided for her first session. "Getting suspended for something I didn't do," Maya replied, surprised by how good it felt to speak the truth without having to carefully measure her words for political implications. Sensei Thompson nodded as if he had expected something like this. "Ah, the classic technique of turning defense into offense. Your opponents have discovered that they can't beat you directly, so they're trying to remove you from the game entirely." Maya looked at him with surprise, not having expected such immediate understanding from someone who barely knew her. "How did you know?" "Because I've seen it before," Sensei Thompson said, his expression growing serious. "Bullies are fundamentally cowards, and when they encounter someone who won't be intimidated, they often resort to manipulation of authority figures. They understand that most adults will choose the path of least resistance rather than confront uncomfortable truths." He led Maya onto the mats, where they began with basic stretching and meditation exercises. The familiar routine helped center her thoughts and calm the anger that had been building throughout the day. As they moved through increasingly complex warm-up drills, Maya felt her body remembering movements and principles that had been dormant since leaving Portland. "Tell me about your training philosophy," Sensei Thompson said as they practiced basic throws against minimal resistance. "What did Sensei Nakamura teach you about the purpose of martial arts?" Maya considered the question as she executed a perfect uchimata, her muscle memory intact, despite months away from training. "He taught me that judo is about finding the point where minimum effort produces maximum effect, not just in physical techniques but in life. The goal is not to overpower your opponent but to redirect their energy until they defeat themselves." "And how might that principle apply to your current situation?" The question hung in the air as Maya worked through a series of ground fighting techniques, her mind processing the connection between her training and her real-world challenges. Chelsea's campaign against her was built on aggression and manipulation, tactics that required victims who would either submit to intimidation or respond with equally aggressive behavior. By maintaining her dignity and refusing to be provoked into retaliation, Maya had already begun to redirect that energy. "She needs me to be the villain in her story," Maya said suddenly, the realization coming to her with startling clarity. "That's why she's trying to make me look like a threat. If I respond with anger or violence, I prove her right. But if I stay calm and principled, her tactics start to look petty and cruel." Sensei Thompson smiled, pleased with her insight. "Exactly. The strongest technique in judo is often the one that requires no physical contact at all. Sometimes the best way to throw someone is to let them throw themselves." They spent the next 2 hours working through increasingly advanced techniques, Maya's body and mind reconnecting with the discipline and focus that had sustained her through previous challenges. By the time the session ended, she felt more centered and purposeful than she had since arriving in Millbrook. That evening, Maya's parents returned home from work to find her calmly doing homework at the kitchen table, her suspension letter placed prominently beside her textbooks. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary, her parents' initial shock and concern gradually giving way to understanding, as Maya explained the full context of her situation. Her father, David, was furious about the school's handling of the situation, his engineer's mind immediately grasping the logical flaws in the administration's response. "They're punishing you for being the victim," he said, his usually calm demeanor cracking with indignation. This is exactly the kind of institutional bias we were hoping to avoid by moving here. Her mother, Linda, was more focused on the emotional toll the harassment was taking on her daughter. She had noticed the changes in Maya's behavior since starting at Jefferson High, the way her naturally optimistic personality had become guarded and defensive. The suspension felt like a culmination of all the small injustices Maya had endured, a breaking point that demanded action. "We're going to fight this," Linda said firmly. "I'll contact the school board. Hire a lawyer if necessary. This isn't just about you, Maya. It's about whether schools are going to protect bullies or stand up for what's right." Maya felt a surge of gratitude for her parents' support, but she also recognized that their involvement could escalate the situation in ways that might ultimately make things worse. The Morrison family's influence within the community meant that any formal challenge to the school's authority would likely be met with significant resistance. "I appreciate that you want to help," Maya said carefully, "but I think there might be a better way to handle this. Sometimes the best response to injustice is to demonstrate what justice looks like through your own actions." That night, as Maya lay in bed with the brass coin resting on her nightstand, she thought about her grandmother's stories of facing discrimination in her early years in America. The challenges had been different then, more overtly hostile, but also more clearly defined. Maya's situation was more subtle, wrapped in the language of school policy and student safety, but the underlying dynamics were similar. Her grandmother had survived and thrived not by defeating her opponents directly, but by building a life of such obvious dignity and value that their prejudices became irrelevant. She had focused on her own growth and community building rather than on responding to every slight and injustice. Perhaps Maya's path forward lay not in fighting Chelsea's games, but in demonstrating an alternative approach to strength and leadership. The next morning brought unexpected developments that would reshape the entire dynamic at Jefferson High. Derek had spent the evening documenting every instance of harassment Maya had experienced, creating a detailed timeline with witness accounts and photographic evidence. But more importantly, he had reached out to other students who had been victims of Chelsea's campaign of intimidation over the years. What he discovered was a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond Maya's case. Chelsea had systematically targeted anyone who threatened her social position or refused to acknowledge her authority, using a sophisticated combination of social exclusion, rumor campaigns, and manipulation of authority figures to maintain her dominance. Her victims included students from various backgrounds and social groups, united only by their shared experience of helplessness in the face of her tactics. Derek's investigation revealed that Chelsea's influence was both more extensive and more fragile than anyone had realized. Her power depended on the isolation of her victims and the complicity of bystanders who were too frightened to speak up. But when presented with the opportunity to stand together, many of these previously silent witnesses were ready to tell their stories. By the time Maya arrived at the Judo Academy for her second day of training, a quiet revolution was beginning at Jefferson High. Students who had never spoken to each other were comparing their experiences and discovering that they were not alone. Teachers who had suspected problems but lacked concrete evidence were suddenly presented with detailed accounts of systematic harassment. Parents who had wondered why their children seemed unhappy at school were finally getting answers. Maya knew nothing of these developments as she worked through advanced randori sessions with Sensei Thompson and several of his senior students. She was focused entirely on reconnecting with her martial arts practice, finding in the physical and mental discipline a source of strength that no external circumstances could touch. "Your technique is solid," Sensei Thompson observed, as Maya successfully threw a much larger opponent using superior timing and leverage. "But I can see that your mind is still processing other challenges. In Judo, we learn that true strength comes from complete presence in the moment. When you step onto these mats, everything else must fall away." Maya nodded, understanding the wisdom of his words but struggling to implement them fully. The injustice of her suspension, the uncertainty about her future at Jefferson High, and the knowledge that Chelsea's campaign against her was likely intensifying in her absence, all competed for her attention. "How do you find that presence when the world outside the dojo is chaotic?" she asked. Sensei Thompson smiled, recognizing the universal struggle of every serious martial artist. "By remembering that the most important battle is always the one within yourself. External circumstances can challenge you, test you, even harm you. But they cannot touch the core of who you are unless you allow them to. Your opponents have power over your situation, but only you have power over your response. As Maya continued her training that afternoon, she gradually began to understand what he meant. The harassment she had experienced, the false accusations, even her suspension were all external events that had no bearing on her fundamental worth or integrity. By allowing them to define her emotional state, she was giving her opponents a victory they had not actually earned. Instead, she could choose to view these challenges as opportunities to demonstrate the principles her grandmother had taught her, to embody the strength and resilience that the brass coin represented. The question was not whether she could defeat Chelsea Morrison in some dramatic confrontation, but whether she could maintain her own integrity while building something positive from the chaos around her. That realization would prove crucial in the days to come, as events at Jefferson High continued to unfold in ways that none of the participants could have anticipated. Maya's removal from the school had created a vacuum that other students were beginning to fill, and the story she thought was ending was actually just beginning to transform into something much larger than anyone had imagined. 3 days into Maya's suspension, Principal Watson received a call that would change everything at Jefferson High. The caller identified herself as Janet Chen, Maya's mother, and her voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to dealing with institutional bureaucracy. "Principal Watson, I'm calling to inform you that my daughter will be returning to school tomorrow morning," Linda said, her tone professional but unyielding. "The suspension was based on false allegations, and we have documentation proving it." Derek had spent those 3 days quietly building a coalition of students who had experienced Chelsea's harassment. Armed with detailed testimonies and photographic evidence, he had presented his findings not just to the school administration, but to several parents who served on the school board. The Morrison family's influence, while considerable, could not withstand the weight of documented systematic bullying that had gone unchecked for years. When Maya walked through the doors of Jefferson High the next morning, she found a transformed environment. Students who had previously averted their eyes now met her gaze with respectful nods. The hallways buzzed with quiet conversations about accountability and change. Most importantly, Chelsea Morrison was notably absent, having been placed on administrative leave while the school board conducted its own investigation. Maya made her way to the cafeteria during lunch period, her heart steady but alert. The brass coin in her pocket provided familiar comfort, but she no longer needed its reassurance to feel confident in her own strength. 3 days of intensive judo training had reconnected her with the physical and mental discipline that would serve her well in whatever challenges remained. The cafeteria fell unusually quiet as Maya entered, students instinctively sensing that something significant was about to unfold. She moved through the lunch line methodically, selecting a turkey sandwich and bottled water with the same careful consideration she had shown on that first disastrous day. But this time, when she reached for her wallet to pay, she discovered that her meal had already been covered by an anonymous benefactor. Maya chose a table near the center of the room, no longer seeking the shadows or corners where she had previously tried to remain invisible. As she unwrapped her sandwich, she noticed movement at the far end of the cafeteria. Chelsea Morrison had arrived despite her supposed suspension, flanked by Jessica and Amber, her face flushed with barely controlled rage. "Well, well," Chelsea announced loudly as she approached Maya's table, her voice carrying across the silent cafeteria. "Look who's back. Did you enjoy your little vacation?" Maya looked up calmly, chewing her bite of sandwich before responding. "I enjoyed the time to reflect on what really matters," she said quietly, her voice steady and clear. Chelsea's face twisted with fury at Maya's composed response. She had expected to find her target broken and demoralized, ready to flee at the first sign of confrontation. Instead, she faced someone who seemed more centered and confident than ever. "You think you've won something?" Chelsea hissed, stepping closer to Maya's table. "You got me suspended for 3 days, but I'm back now, and things are going to be very different." "The only thing that's different," Maya replied, standing slowly, "is that now everyone can see who you really are." Jessica moved to flank Maya, her athletic build intended to intimidate through sheer physical presence. "You made a big mistake coming back here," she said, cracking her knuckles theatrically. "Some people never learn." Maya remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled and her posture relaxed. 3 days of intensive training had sharpened her reflexes, and reminded her body of movements that had become instinctive through years of practice. More importantly, her time away from school had provided perspective on what this confrontation really represented. "I'm not going to fight you," Maya said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent cafeteria. "But I'm also not going to run away." Chelsea's face contorted with rage at this calm defiance. She had built her entire social identity around the ability to intimidate others into submission, and Maya's refusal to be cowed represented an existential threat to her carefully constructed world. "Fine," Chelsea snarled, reaching across the table to grab Maya's lunch tray. "Let's see how confident you are when you're hungry again." But as Chelsea's hand closed around the plastic tray, Maya moved with fluid precision. Her right hand intercepted Chelsea's wrist in a grip that appeared gentle but contained absolute control. Using Chelsea's own forward momentum and a subtle shift of her hips, Maya executed a perfect teguruma, a hand-wheel throw that sent Chelsea tumbling over the table and onto the floor behind her. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds and appeared almost effortless, as if Chelsea had simply lost her balance and fallen. But every student who witnessed it understood that they had seen something extraordinary. A perfect demonstration of technique overcoming aggression, of skill transcending size and social status. Jessica lunged forward immediately, her face red with embarrassment and anger. But Maya was ready, sidestepping the clumsy attack and using Jessica's own momentum to guide her into a controlled yukimi, a breakfall that deposited her safely but decisively on the floor beside Chelsea. Amber, seeing her two allies dispatched with such casual efficiency, took a step backward, her earlier bravado evaporating in the face of Maya's demonstrated skill. The cafeteria erupted in gasps and excited whispers as students pulled out their phones to record what had just occurred. Maya stood calmly over her fallen opponents, her breathing barely elevated despite the physical exertion. She looked down at Chelsea, who was struggling to her feet with a mixture of shock and humiliation on her face. "Judo teaches us that every attack contains the seeds of its own defeat," Maya said quietly, her words carrying clearly in the hushed cafeteria. "You can't build strength by tearing others down." Chelsea scrambled to her feet, her perfect hair disheveled and her designer clothes wrinkled from her encounter with the cafeteria floor. Her face cycled through a series of emotions: shock, rage, embarrassment, and finally a calculating coldness that suggested she was not finished. "This isn't over," Chelsea said, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. "You think one lucky throw makes you special? I'll destroy you for this." Maya picked up her sandwich and took another bite, her actions deliberate and unhurried. "You already tried to destroy me," she said calmly. "It didn't work then, and it won't work now." The crowd of students had grown larger, drawn by the commotion and the rapidly spreading news that the quiet new girl had just demonstrated martial arts skills that none of them had suspected. Cell phone cameras captured every moment, ensuring that the confrontation would be preserved and shared across social media within minutes. Derek pushed through the crowd, his face showing a mixture of concern and admiration. "Maya, are you okay?" he asked, though it was clear that she was more than okay. "I'm fine," Maya replied, offering him a genuine smile. "Just having lunch." Chelsea's face flushed an even deeper red at this casual dismissal of what she had intended to be a moment of dramatic humiliation. She looked around the cafeteria, suddenly aware that the crowd was not offering her the support and sympathy she had expected. Instead, she saw faces filled with curiosity, respect, and in some cases, barely concealed satisfaction at seeing her finally face consequences for her behavior. "Come on," Chelsea said to her remaining allies, her voice lacking its usual authority. "We don't need to waste any more time on this loser." But as she turned to leave, Maya's voice stopped her. "Chelsea," she called, her tone gentle but carrying absolute certainty. "The next time you want to take someone's lunch money, maybe ask yourself if it's really worth it." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy, cutting through Chelsea's defenses and exposing the petty cruelty that lay at the heart of her actions. For the first time in years, Chelsea Morrison found herself without a comeback, without a way to reframe the situation to her advantage. As Chelsea and her diminished entourage retreated from the cafeteria, the crowd of students began to disperse, their excited conversations creating a buzz of energy that would reverberate through Jefferson High for weeks to come. Maya finished her lunch in peaceful contemplation, the brass coin in her pocket warm against her palm. Derek sat down across from her, shaking his head in amazement. "I can't believe what just happened," he said. "Where did you learn to do that?" Maya smiled, thinking of Sensei Nakamura's teachings and the generations of strong women who had carried the brass coin before her. "Sometimes," she said, "the strength you need has been inside you all along. You just have to remember how to use it." The confrontation in the cafeteria became legendary at Jefferson High, but not for the reasons Chelsea had intended. Instead of demonstrating her power over others, it had revealed the hollowness of bullying tactics when faced with genuine strength and dignity. Maya's response had been perfectly measured, enough force to neutralize the threat, but no more than necessary. In the days that followed, Maya found herself surrounded by students who had previously been too intimidated to speak up against injustice. Her demonstration had not just defeated Chelsea's immediate attack, it had broken the spell of fear that had kept an entire school community silent in the face of systematic harassment. The brass coin remained in Maya's pocket, its purpose fulfilled not through magical intervention, but through its reminder of the courage and resilience that had always been her birthright. She had learned that true strength was not about defeating opponents but about standing firm in your principles, regardless of the consequences. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.